this quote kind of sort of summarizes that, which is, yeah, kind of a people without the knowledge of their past, history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. So we're gonna talk a lot about roots and kind of the heritage, really. But I think one thing we want to do that just before we get into kind of like our sort of chosen landscape, i.e. Islamic, kind of the Islamic world, we just want to look a little bit outside of that. And as Sami said, we want this to be a bit of a conversation. So perhaps in the kind of in the chat, if the participants can kind of maybe try and answer some of these questions, it would be great. So as I said, we want to look just outside of the Islamic world for now and see how other cultures and places have tackled this sort of similar sort of conversation, i.e. The contemporary but steeped in heritage. So just a little bit of a kind of an interactive section really, which is to kind of just ask, does anyone know what this project is? Doesn't anyone know where it is? So I'm not sure if I can see the chat, but I don't know if
anyone wants to answer, please answer in the chat, and then I'll probably, because you've got a phone, Abra, haven't you? So
I'm on the phone. Yeah. Sorry.
I think this one is a pretty hard one. Probably many of our audience will find it hard. I mean, I found it hard myself.
It is tricky. So this is actually in Japan, and it's it's an art pavilion, but based on a kind of a traditional Japanese Zen sort of philosophy, essentially, and it's kind of a spiritual temple place. So we thought that was quite interesting in that there is definitely elements of traditional Japanese architecture in the kind of pagoda, but nevertheless in a kind of a contemporary sort of scenario. But what we found interesting as well about this project was that they used this project to kind of maintain and save old age craft that's almost being lost, which is the roofing tiles of the pavilion itself, and we thought that was an interesting way to. It's a very contemporary piece, but the kind of the heritage element is in actually trying to preserve the process, so to speak. So that's one in Japan. Mohammed, you can move on to the next one, I guess.
Yeah.
See if people.
Yeah, there's another project, if people are aware of it, can mention on the chat, what it is.
We can give you a clue. It's by an architect called Zumthor, Peter Zumthor. Anyone know of him?
The thing about this,
I think it's very difficult.
Yeah, to manage that. Yeah.
Conclude,
yeah, that's fine. I mean, we will continue as it is. So yeah, it is a chapel, a Christian chapel in Germany by Peter Zumthor again. Is bringing some of the traditional thinking about the space and enveloping it in something very modern and contemporary. And putting it in a setting of fields, which is again not a traditional way of finding a church or a chapel or place to retreat oneself. We thought it was really interesting about how is used local materials and the technique to achieve some of the elements of awe or grandeur within the space. This is Abra, another project.
So this is the last one, and we'll move on. So again, I'm not sure if there's any guesses, but perhaps just to make it a bit easier, it's in Canada, and it's the National Holocaust Monument, designed by Liebeskind, and again a contemporary take with lots of kind of elements of kind of the Jewish sort of tradition as well. So we
project about this, because I've noticed within the three projects, I mean, they all obviously look very much at the future, but maybe the only one that takes some sort of notion from the past is the Japanese one. because, as you mentioned before, it does have that shape of a pagoda that connects it to the sort of Zen culture, where, you know, if someone was to connect this monument, for example, to the Holocaust, or even the chapel to the religion of Christianity, it would be very difficult in a way. So it's then,
yeah, I know. I totally get your point. I guess we were trying to just see to what extent can a particular language that is synonymous with any culture be pushed. So yeah, the chapel, I guess, is like a much more sort of a further afield example. But the sentiments, I guess, is that it's a spiritual space that you experience was maintained within that. But yeah, totally understand what you're saying.
I just like to add that any questions or comments can be written in the chat, and we will refer them to our
Mohammed,
two
are you there?
architects.
Yeah, I'm here.
okay.
Yeah, I think even in this memorial, I think what the architect or the designer has done very subtly is try to bring the Star of David within the plan, which is not really experienced once you're there, but can be seen.
Oh, I see. I'm noticing it now. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. It's but because of the geometry, which is once you're inside, you probably don't notice it. But
you can see it only from afar. You can't see it.
Exactly. So there are some elements, again, like Abra said, is pushing those boundaries to refer to his heritage. So
now we enter a field which is probably more of, you know, connected.
More of what we may be familiar with within the Islamic heritage. Abra, do you want to?
So yeah, I mean, we've done obviously a look outside, as Mohammed said, kind of looking at a little bit in something a little bit more familiar within this space. So we've chosen a minaret as a kind of an architectural piece to just sort of do a little bit of a kind of a study, which is one of geographical, so different regions, but also kind of like different time frames. And I think it's interesting for us to see how these have evolved over the kind of the centuries, and how they've become sort of masterpieces and known worldwide. I think we also want to kind of touch upon a little bit about, Mohammed, I think we were discussing a little bit about like what allowed these masterpieces to be created, so to speak. What was the backdrop?
Yeah, definitely. I think, we were thinking, or we usually think about, if these masterpieces have emerged, it makes us think like what those people who made these, what was going through their mind, what kind of society they lived in, what kind of technology they had to achieve these kind of structures, and what kind of conversations they used to have amongst each other. And I think this kind of dived into more the roots and the reasons and the grassroots reasons of these structures that have become a reference point to this day. A lot of new structures we see that references these masterpieces. I think it's important to see what led to innovation. I think these structures were innovative at their time, and they remain to be innovative. And sometimes we overlook that what led these people to achieve this kind of structure.
Yeah.
Again, this is another example which comes a lot across, and a lot of people get references from this. It's a mosque in Iran. You can see the detail in this piece, the craft that's gone behind it, the geometry. One can spend days trying to understand the detail and the craft that's gone behind it, and you can see the sense of scale, the colors. And these are some of the elements that we pick up, but books can be written about some of these pieces, and they continue to remain a reference point.
So just moving away from Iran, on the next slide, I believe is Cordoba in Spain. Is it loading up?
Yeah.
So again, just focusing on a different element. I think the Iran one, again, we can focus on different aspects of it, as Mohammed rightly pointed out, the real kind of craft, the real detail. With this one, we thought this was interesting in the sense that this is kind of a great example of, you know, a form following sort of function with regards to these arches, which were kind of devised because of their kind of structural strength at the time, rather than because of their sort of arabesque sort of sensibilities, but also because I guess it was in Europe as well. But what's interesting about this particular piece is that it's kind of made its way, horseshoe arches. Yes, thank you, Talha, that's correct. Appreciate it. So yeah, what's interesting about these ones is that we now find them in the Prophet's mosque in Medina, in one of the more newer extensions, and we found that this is kind of quite a strong connection, which is yeah. Oh, it was a synagogue before it was a mosque. Okay, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
I had a question, Abba, about this. You know, because obviously you've shown different examples from different parts of the Islamic world. But, you know, the Muslims themselves, they were, in a way, inheritors of a certain heritage that was there before them. So they,
yeah, absolutely.
Their design was steeped in the previous sort of heritage that they found when they moved there. So it's...
that's amazing, yeah, that's amazing. That kind of adds to Talha's point, actually, that I guess most people's heritage is kind of steeped in other people's heritage. It kind of passing the baton on, so to speak, in some. So yeah, that's really interesting point, which I didn't think about for this presentation, but yeah, critical. Okay, we can move on from this slide.
Yes. I mean, when we talk about Islamic art and architecture, I think our reference point usually sometimes, I mean, most of the cases are the ones we've shown or similar projects that we have shown. I think what gets neglected is the epicenter of Islam, which is the Kaaba. I think we think that the pureness of its geometry and makes it a divine structure. I think there are traditions about how the blueprint of the Kaaba got sent down, and there's academic discussions about those, but we think on purely as geometry and the center, I think sometimes gets overlooked. And for us, I think we love the simplicity of this and how it's sometimes we always try to reference in our projects and our work. We're trying to look back into this simple structure that, yeah.
I have a question on this issue about the origins of Islamic heritage. And when I first heard that you return Islamic design in its basic principles back to the Kaaba, I am correct in my summary of your view?
We try to do that, yes.
Yes, but as Dr. Sami just said, the Muslims inherited at the beginning huge swathes of land with different Byzantine, Roman, even Persian, and different previous influences, even Van Gogh and Berber. So which elements do you think endured from a purely, if you'd like, Arab Meccan Kaaba essence, and which are these elements and how were they implanted in all the other areas the Muslims traveled or settled in?
So I think that's again a very good question and a great point. Absolutely, again, we all know that the Kaaba is pre-Islamic in terms of its history. But I guess what we're saying is that it's thereafter it's naturally the epicenter of what followed from there. Not to say that it's taken inspiration with regards to it's kind of how it's sort of been manifested in other places, but it was just interesting to kind of like, again, like look further back and then kind of like with the view of like reviewing it. And I guess there is that point that there is this common thread that seems to run through all these different sort of civilizations that you've mentioned, that there is an adoption, but an adaptation and a modification as time kind of goes on, and we just find that really fascinating. Yeah, but I think we're going to get back to the Kaaba specifically at a later point, which is again from a more an Islamic history perspective rather than the pre.
Cool. Yeah, diving back to much later than Kaaba, Abra. So we were looking at, we were hoping this would be interactive, but you guys can see the image. We want to see if we were to guess what project or where this project is. I think one can say is very Turkish or Ottoman, even in the outside. And once you actually see this project in more of its context, is in Tokyo. You wouldn't expect a Ottoman mosque to be in Tokyo, but what we are trying to say in this, I suppose, is like how certain elements or how certain architectural designs have become pastiche of this time, where our heritage are kind of replicated within a context that it may not traditionally belong to. This was just a analysis of, or just to show this is one of the examples. Again, you see Blue Mosque in Istanbul, which was built in 1609, and 400 years later in Malaysia. There are, again, a reference point which kind of becomes a pastiche of a mosque. It's interesting how these are examples in their context and how they've become architectural in the new context.
And I guess, Mohammed, this is the difference between this mosque and the previous one is the fact that the first one, there's more of a literal interpretation.
Yes.
In terms of design, material, and everything else, and the look and feel. Whereas with this one is basically, maybe the Blue Mosque, the Sultan Ahmed Mosque is the base for their design, but obviously then they change with material.
Yeah, so the local elements are kind of emerged. You can see some of the arches, which are more Malay. You can see some of the dome structure, which are Malay again.
Yeah.
So it's like a marrying the local architecture, I suppose, with the Blue Mosque. One can say successful or not. I think that's a different conversation. But I think it's more of how these masterpieces have continued to become a reference point for modern day architecture when it comes to mosque. This is a mosque in Abra. Are you there? Have you lost Abra?
Okay. 1 second. You can continue, Mohammed.
That's fine. Yeah. So this is a mosque in UK, Bradford. This is some of the predicaments that in UK as designers or as locals we face. Abra usually calls this a reverse colonialization, where a Pakistani community in Bradford have brought this nostalgia of a mosque from back home and kind of embedded into Bradford, using local materials like brick and trying to marry the two. For us, I think some of this appear to be quite alien, like a minaret and a dome, which does not usually belong in this context, has kind of been superimposed in Bradford, UK context.
So, Mohammed,
yes,
you think it was intentional to marry the sort of red brick with the mosque design, or was it because that was what was available in the
I think it's a combination of both. I think because red brick material is really widely available, and in the local context, like the Baladia, you guys may call it, would love to. They sometimes push for those kind of brick materiality to be used. So I think it's a bit of both. It's a push from trying to fit it in, as well as trying to bring some of the other elements which don't usually belong to this context.
And which elements do you think are, if you can call them, of Pakistani essence, or aren't there?
The thing is, I've done so maybe not. I wouldn't say I can refer to a Pakistani essence. I think Islamic architecture, you can say, maybe. Okay. Like you can look at.
I mean, an example. Am I back? Yeah, I was on mute. I left. Yeah. So yeah, I think that the kind of the local context of the material is in our opinion, is a kind of a good example of it trying to sort of bed in, i.e. the red brick. I think there is a sort of a church and obviously residentials around that area. But what feels like the hybrid element in this particular instance is, for instance, the dome not being there and kind of being planted on, literally, like within that kind of. So although it's trying to do something nice in the context of trying to like sort of fit in, but then it kind of the way the dome is done feels detached from the rest of the building, if that makes sense.
Salma, can you elaborate in the chat what do you mean by mashrabiyat al-khashab?
Yeah, the green ones, maybe the green so balconies, they're made of wood.
Yes.
And they probably could represent a more sort of South Asian element. I guess that's what she's saying.
That's exactly.
I think that's definitely part of it. The onion domes are also typical of the South Asian Islamic sort of repertoire, of course. But the rest, I mean, as Ismail said it before, I think he mentioned, it almost looks like a school in Northern England, where a couple of domes and a minaret are being cut off.
Put on top, exactly.
Yeah, basically, that's what.
I think the green thing's interesting. We're going to get to a project later on that we've worked on, where in the particular area the project is located in, green. When it comes, you'll see when it comes to like the roof material and the tile material is like the local character of that place, which we've tried to reference in a project, rather than it being perhaps maybe. Any other kind of association in terms of color, if that makes sense. So yeah, we can move on for good old Bradford to the next slide. We love Bradford, isn't it?
One of the other elements of Islamic art and architecture, I think we kind of we come across a lot is the geometry, the arabesque, the pattern. I mean, we are not expert on this field, but I think it comes a lot as a reference point, and how these get implemented kind of shows that level of understanding of those buildings, that the thought that's gone behind it. As an example, like this is an airport in Rabat in Morocco that tries to implement Islamic geometry within its facade, and you can see how unsuccessful this may be.
I would like to ask the audience to give their opinions over this airport and then the one we're gonna see later on. Yeah,
for sure. Abra, do you want to?
Yeah, look at that.
Abra? I love Abra again.
I don't know what happens, but yeah, you can continue.
That's okay. So this is a again a airport in Morocco where the Islamic geometry or the patination has actually not just become a mere ornamentation, but actually part of the structure that has become more functional in terms of structure, in terms of the span, and how it becomes an interior element as well as the exterior element. We can say this is a successful implementation of those patination and geometry.
Am I back or am I
Oh,
gone
you are
again?
back. There you go.
Sorry, guys. Apologies.
That's all right. You can talk about this one.
Oh, okay. So this is an interesting one. We couldn't find the exact location, unfortunately, but we came across it. And it's kind of it's a medium one. It's got elements of what we feel are kind of really good ones, and also elements of not necessarily so. But I think it's more to do with the fact that they've tried to marry two different approaches. This hybrid hasn't necessarily worked, for instance, in our opinion. But I think if it was one or the other, it could have been a really kind of a good example of a modern interpretation of these sort of elements, really. So I think, yeah, that's somewhere in between the good and the not so good.
And this is an example again of Islamic Muslim Cultural Center in China. I think this is what's interesting about this is how a complete different culture in modern context, i.e. China, a Chinese designer has actually well understood the principles of Islamic architecture and geometry and has resulted into a very successful piece of architecture in its rights in terms of the arches and the patination and in modern context.
Can I just say something about this particular design? I mean, I find it extremely fascinating, also because you can't really pinpoint the origin of not just the congregation, the architects. One issue that modern mosques, for example, contemporary mosques have in the West, but also in the Muslim country, is that the style is, you can connect the styles to a certain ethnicity. For example, you can find the Pakistani mosque, you can have the Moroccan mosque, you can have the Turkish mosque, and you see it all over the world. They have this particular style, but this particular one, I find it quite unique in that you can't really reconnect to anything. It's almost like a mosque that is looking at the Islamic principles by projecting into the future without connecting to any particular culture.
Definitely, I think like you said, it's very, very, yeah. It kind of blurs the origin of it and against implemented in the current modern times. That's really interesting for sure.
I guess because it's a cultural center that's like for the wider Muslim world in China, I guess they've probably been very sensitive to that rather than kind of like, picking a specific style, aesthetic from any particular region. But yeah, very, very interesting observation.
Yeah. Based on that, before we move into some of our projects, I think this is a quotation by Norman Foster, an architect, who says, as an architect, you design for the present with an awareness of the past for a future which is essentially unknown. I think this is a battle which, or challenge as modern architects or designers that many faces, because the future is unknown. How do you design something to future-proof that becomes timeless? And this is a internal struggle, would you say, Abra, that we try to... Yeah,
for sure. we felt this was summarized really well, I guess, this topic. So we did say we would go back to the Kaaba specifically, and this was a kind of a self-initiated studio project that we did this time last year, which was essentially looking at trying to like reimagine what the kiswa, which is the covering of the Kaaba, looks like. And what we actually did with most of the designs anyway is look back at earlier versions and just adapted them. But it was interesting. We got a really interesting reaction. Some people liked it. A lot of people really disliked it. And we thought it was interesting in that what we had done was not necessarily suggest anything new. We had kind of gone into the archive, so to speak, of what we were able to find, and just reimagined it, visualized it in a more kind of modern context. But again, it's that kind of like the blurring those boundaries between like the heritage and how people perceive certain things which are are they kind of
drawing on that?
Yeah, I noticed. Oh dear.
Who is that? That's not me for sure.
Who's drawing it? I don't
know.
Okay.
Strange.
It happened to me in also I was opening a presentation on Zoom, and the same thing was happening to me. I couldn't get rid of it. I'm
Looks
not
like
sure.
It's
going to be there for the rest of the presentation. Okay, nice.
We have to live with it.
Someone's marking our work.
I mean, look, that's the heritage from the previous slide.
Is it a sign that they really like that design, or they maybe hated it? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. But I think that might have been us. Anyway, okay.
Do you want to close the PowerPoint presentation and reopen it? It will disappear.
Will we do that?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Give me a second.
Yeah, we can do that.
Give me a second.
So you've got experience from that. That's great. Oh, okay. No worries.
Okay.
Okay, give me a second. I'll have to
try erasing it.
Abir is saying sorry, so maybe it was Abir who did the writing, who did the scribbling.
Forgiven.
No problem.
You back, Mohammed?
Yeah, just give me 1 second. It's literally it's just loading. I just need to go to the right slide and I'll share again.
So I think it's one of the attendees. There is this way where you can interact with the PowerPoint presentation. I think that's how it works. Yeah.
Yeah, Zoom allows you to annotate. And make notes. Which is really it's a really useful tool in this COVID world.
Yes, a lot of all around the world, the cultural events move to Zoom.
Yeah.
So you can have a more international audience, which is fun.
Which is good.
Which can work, yeah.
You're back, Mohammed? Yeah.
I'm back. Can you guys see?
Yeah. You're sharing the screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, just loading.
I'm pretty sure that many people have got different questions also for the previous slides, because obviously some of these, like the mosques that we see in modern mosques, some of them might be considered more successful, some of them a bit less. So I'll be interested to know what people think is the right combination to have a model that is respectful of the past, but also quite an innovation in a way.
Yeah. I don't know why it's doing this. Oh yeah, there we go. So this is a project we're working on. It's a mosque project. in Pakistan. It's a very small mosque, community mosque in a village. You can see we've tried to use the local materials within the local context. However, some of the elements that we have brought in are again trying to be as within Islamic heritage. So this is a very quick plan. It's all about direction. It's try to use the arch within the plan, and the arch is kind of again replicated within the prayer spaces, and then in the inside, this element of height and the scale is kind of very evident once you are inside, and the direction is very evident again. Yeah. Want to add anything on this, Abra? Sorry.
I think
no, it's good.
It sort of follows whatever you just said. You know, the local material, the sort of consideration for the past, the consideration also for the location, but you guys have tried to do it in a very contemporary way. So
yeah, we try.
how has it been appreciated by the community? What do they think of it? Because also it must look quite different from other mosques in Pakistan.
Yes. So when the designs were shared with the local kind of community that had instructed the mosque, we were initially sort of apprehensive whether such a contemporary design would go down well, but we were pleasantly surprised that actually they really liked the fact that it was contemporary, because it kind of gave the community a real uplift in that naturally it's based on traditional elements, but it's kind of future looking in many ways. So yeah, really got it got a great reception, and yeah. So although as I said, we were a little bit apprehensive, but I think sometimes it's worth pushing the boundaries, because people have different expectations, and people's observations can change, and we found that pretty much so on this particular one. Yeah. But again, it's a very simple, very modest mosque, but it has these kind of more grander elements that most places of worship have a sense of volume when you get inside, 2-story, 3-story, and this does it in a gradual way, with the idea of it kind of, the closer you get to the front line, the higher the ceiling gets, so to speak, because of the way it elevates upwards. So yeah, we try to remain elements. We try to keep those kind of elements, even in a smaller mosque, essentially. Cool.
Okay.
Carry on, Abra.
Yeah, that's it, I think. Yeah.
Next slide.
Oh, I can't see the next slide. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I can see it now. So just moving on to another project, which is a smaller kind of public pavilion that moved around. But I think one thing that we were interested in is kind of like, I guess, the values that drove some of these masterpieces. Where were they taking their inspirations from? And this piece was kind of essentially looking at mercy, ay rahma, and it was a public pavilion which was like an information point for people to find out a bit more about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in terms of that kind of context. So we just looked at, again, the arches, which we found to be something that is to do with mercy. That mercy is like an arch that kind of like covers and protects certain things. So we use that as the reference point. Here's a little video. If you go to the video, Mohammed, this basically gives you an idea of. So this was in Leicester Square in London, and it's moved around to a few different places, and it goes up. It's a temporary.
Mercy, kindness, and duty. A man who repelled evil with virtue and beauty. A man who brought forgiveness and inspired the truth. A man who dispelled racism and was never aloof. A man who sought justice and the end of oppression. A man who was forbearing through trial and repression. A man who loved orphans and supported the weak. A man who gave life to the rights that we seek. a man with compassion and loving grace, a man who smiled at every face, a man who affirmed and taught God's divinity, a man who inspired hope and endless serenity, a man who was upright, honest and kind. He was the Prophet Muhammad, a mercy to mankind.
So yeah, that's kind of, I guess, just taking some of these values that we found within this theme and try to kind of encapsulate that in a very public pavilion, which went down really well. If we move on to the next slide. Sorry, this coordination in different places is a bit difficult.
Yeah, this is a project which we are recently working on, and yeah, it's within our local context. It's in Brixton. This is where our studio is based. As Abra mentioned earlier, when we look at it's doing a feasibility study for local mosque that we attend, that they had asked us to look at what potential and unlock some of the potentials that they may be able to do. And this is a brief site. We see the green domes, we see the green materiality, we see a lot of towers around, and it's very close to central, the city of London. This is the current mosque. As a lot of the mosques in London, they're not usually purpose built. They find a building, they either acquire it through other means, or they have acquired it many years ago. And as the community has grown, the need for the mosque and the space has grown, and they found place in the space, and they've tried to respond to those needs. So we were asked to have a fresh look, do a study, what potentially could they achieve with the building. So there's a long study we did, but this is just to summarize some of the findings we had and just share these with you. So this is their current mosque. Currently, you see the plan is very broken, and you can see how they have expanded as the town has grown on the ground floor, and you see the Qibla direction is not orienting towards the Qibla. So once you go in, you have to orient it yourself to make sure you're facing the Qibla. So it's essentially a house that was a house or some sort of building that's been converted into a mosque. So this is just to summarize our concept. Our proposal was to have a prayer space which has a direct correlation with the Qibla, and all of the other programs which we suggested would go at the back, at the rear, and play with the height to achieve some of the elements. And yeah, this is some of the plan. We actually proposed like a gallery, because in London, you would know, we usually find the mosques to be quite to be a bit unwelcoming. So a bit
insular.
Insular, yeah, it's very insular. So we tried to come out of this, and our proposal, we suggested to have a gallery on the ground floor that could have exhibitions, that welcomes people. We suggested to have a community kitchen at the back that invites people to come and eat, some other elements of shelter home, and further studies which we carried. Essentially, this is our current proposal, which we have proposed is a soft, element with a very open ground, which references some of the local roofing, and essentially uplifts the community, as Abra mentioned earlier, to give confidence to actually do community engagement and do welcome the wider community and be proud of their local heritage. This mosque has been here for about, was it 20 years, Abra? The community?
Since the 70s, maybe, no, since the 80s, so like 50 years,
Yeah, 50 years, and this hopefully, so we just presented this proposal, and the other studies which we carried, there's still a bit of work to do in terms of the next steps, but this is some of our proposals for them.
Mohammed, you wanted to mention also the choice of material, which is
yes,
in a way reflective of the openness.
Yes. So we are trying to achieve, there's two things. Firstly, to try and introduce some of the local green domes, which we saw at the beginning, like green material. We're trying to bring that in, as well as trying to have some kind of transparency within the activities of the masjid. Because usually when we see mosques in London, they're like boxed up. We don't see what really goes on. As a non-Muslim who lives within the locality of mosque, try to do an architecture that's actually inviting, basically. So that's the idea behind the materiality in terms of transparency and light and yeah.
I think we have another 5 minutes where we can discuss the last.
Yeah, we will do our best to conclude
so that we can move on to the Q&A session afterwards.
Abra?
Yeah. Okay. So conscious of time, this is probably the last project we're going to show, but it's the one that I guess shows a bit more of our process. If you go to the next slide, please. Is it the slide that's got the?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So this was part of London Design Festival a few years ago. So we entered this competition, which we had won. It was based on a theme that they had, which is love is power. So we kind of derived, our hypothesis really was derived from this particular saying or hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, which was love for humanity, what you love for yourself. And essentially this concept kind of made us look into two different things really. One, which is it talks about the individual, i.e. yourself, and it talks about your fellow human being, i.e. the communal aspect. Also, the interesting thing about the word love and the word hub is that it's got that kind of like double meaning in English. Is like the hub, a place that people connect, people come to. So we thought that was interesting. And we played around with that in terms of kind of creating this identity piece, which we wanted to kind of explore. I think that the next part, yeah.
Yeah, so the idea, I think, again, it became looking at what as community, as Muslim communities, what element it is that brings people together, essentially the mosque. The mosque is what brings communities together for past many hundreds of years. So that was our reference point, is because it's not just a place for prayer, it's also a place where births are announced, where funerals happen, where marriages happen. So traditionally, when you look at the time of Prophet, it was a hub for the community. Essentially, there's two elements which we derived in the mosque, which is a minaret and the prayer hall. So we wanted to concentrate in the minaret as it was a device that was used traditionally to call people in, whether it was for prayer or for any other announcements. And obviously with the advance of technology, that person has been replaced with microphones, but nonetheless, the minaret continues as a language, as an architectural language to modern day. These are some of the minarets around the world, which we kind of referenced again from different times. And as a prayer hall, again, you see the grandeur, which is very accessed by the public, and is the main activity that happens is in the prayer hall. And the element of a dome, which is very critical in traditional mosques. Abra?
Yeah. So essentially the minaret is quite an exclusive sort of architectural device, which usually the muadhin, the person who calls the people to prayer, has access to. As well, the prayer hall is far more inclusive in a communal space. So we were interested in looking at how these two could potentially come together, because we were looking at not necessarily a prayer space, but a kind of a public pavilion. So essentially making the inclusive and the exclusive almost sort of hybridized. And this kind of like developed in the idea that usually the muadhin is at the top, so we literally sort of flipped it 180 and made it accessible from the bottom, which would invite people kind of in. So this idea of a visual, of an audio call, i.e. the adhan, becomes a visual call because of the materiality is mirror. So it's kind of like it's calling you in. And then I think internally, so this is the concept, yeah. So internally, you actually only hear the adhan on the inside rather than on the outside, because it was a space to kind of provide this communality, really. Yeah.
Yeah, and essentially this is what we try to achieve, like to have a minaret that has the experience of geometry, a 3D geometry that can be experienced by a person, which essentially is marrying a dome and a minaret together, hybridizing the two elements, the two main key features of Islamic architecture within the mosque, a minaret and a dome that could essentially be experienced at once. And here is a quick video of 1 minute that summarizes it a bit better than us.
Of our love and power theme perfectly, it's celebrated in a very central message of very faith, love and coming together. The realisation of these relations is just in terms of its time scale, its significant uplift in what we are able to show. So, and again, that is about their dedication to the piece.
As a British Muslim-led organisation, positive narrative that really resonated with us. One of the most powerful pieces in the whole of the design fair this year.
Okay. That was a great video of this particular project, the Hub. And that's the location where it is. Is it on a permanent basis now?
No, I think it's been there since the event, since 2017.
Okay.
Yeah, and there might be conversations about moving it from here. Yeah, for now it's still at the London Mosque.
Okay.
Abra, are you still?
Yeah, I'm still here.
There?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Well, guys,
cool.
Thank you very much for this conversation that we had so far. I mean,
thank you.
Very interesting array of different mosques designed from the past, present, some of your own projects, and we had a very good mix. It would be great if people from the audience could ask you some questions.
Yeah, sure. Just one. If I can interrupt, Sami. Before we take any questions, are you okay if we ask a question to the audience? Because again, we feel that this is a conversation. So we kind of looked at this potentially as like, just would be interested to know what people thought. Has our heritage kind of held us back more recently, or has it kind of propelled us forward? So it'd be really interesting to know your thoughts or any participants' thoughts of how they perceive this question.
Let me repeat it, because obviously that's a very important question. So Abra wants to know if we think that the heritage, if you're Muslim, for example, if the Islamic heritage of the past has hindered, has made the future in a way more difficult, or if in fact it's been of help that could make our present and future more helpful.
Someone's answered.
Yeah, Thalma saying.
So Thalma thinks no, it didn't hinder us. I'd like her to elaborate a bit more on that.
It's of course, I mean it's a complex issue.
It's a very broad.
Yeah, it's very broad. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's really broad.
It's very important to learn from the past, obviously, to learn the good things and the bad things from the past, and trying to improve, of course. So in terms of design, for example, and if I may say, with the Ottoman design, I always had a problem because when you enter some of the courtyards, there is a slight discrepancy in terms of heights and symmetry, and I think it's only during the 19th century where they managed to fix that. But for example, the Great Sinan had always a problem with that, with the steps and the heights. Whereas, you know, if you go, for example, you know, in Turkey, when they sort of imitate or take pride in their past, they fix that issue. So it's interesting.
Yeah. So I've been reading, thank you, Salma, for your comments. I think she's elaborated and fully agree that our heritage is very rich, and it kind of depends on us, really. And I think I fully agree. And I think that the point that we made earlier at the beginning of the presentation with regards to that, it's become a point of reference, which is more than just material. I think when it's more than just kind of ornamental or you know, kind of, it's like a nostalgia. It's very nostalgic, which then kind of sometimes, unfortunately, can create pastiches. But in most cases, I fully agree that actually it's a very rich reference point, which can only really just like the, I think was mentioned earlier, that we're taking different bits from different heritages anyway, and it just only allows you to kind of really enrich it. I feel that it only holds you back when it becomes a pastiche of a golden era. I think that's probably
yes. Arbarar, I'd like to translate the question, because some people might be better in Arabic to answer. So السؤال كان قاعد يطرح سؤال إذا تعتقدون إن تراثنا وحضارتنا القديمة يعني تأخرنا أو تخلينا نتقدم للأمام في أمور نفس العمارة والفن بشكل عام. يعني هل هي تحدنا من التطور أو هي تساعدنا بالأساس إن نتقدم للأمام؟ تقدرون تجاوبون بالعربي or in English، وأنا راح أوجه للضيفين السؤال أو تعليقكم. Yeah, you can continue.
Abra, how would you, in terms of when you find, you know, when you want to look at you give like different examples before. So if you were to describe a successful rendition of past heritage and how it is translated in contemporary design, what kind of qualities do you think the contemporary design should have to be a successful one?
I mean, one that has a really kind of deep understanding of what that heritage is, so that it doesn't become just a pastiche. So I think some of the examples we showed earlier were examples of where it's kind of, I guess, a very surface level understanding, really. But I think that there's many great examples. We showed some. I think there's one that we didn't show, which is the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha. That's an amazing kind of contemporary take. But I think because it looked deep into the culture that it was meant to house its kind of work. So that's a great example. There's I think that's really what it comes down to. But another element is that, again, these masterpieces were very innovative of their time. They were very forward-looking. So it's just it's taking that richness and continuing it, I guess, is something that we're really interested in, to make it relevant, to make it kind of like something that is understood in a modern context.
Okay. I have a question. It's a bit also general. It's presented to you too, and of course, whoever has a question, they can write it in the chat. We will also ask it on their behalf. I wanted to know if you can pinpoint one or two challenges that are specific to mosque building in the West, challenges whereby you feel that you really are in a position where you don't want to disturb the setting, and so you have to really address this question very carefully. If you can answer on that.
Sure. Mohammed, you want to go?
Yeah, I think I'll start, instead of challenge, I think what mosques in the West do successfully, I'd begin with that. I think what mosques do successfully in the West are the sense of community, which even though architecturally they may not appear great, but the community and the grassroots understanding of what mosque is or does, a lot of time there are great examples, well, not every mosque, but there are great examples of that being very evident. So you have a very, so that the sense of hub, the mosque being a hub, I think that's quite successful.
I think my question, I didn't specify. I meant architecturally.
Yeah, sure. So,
not socially.
Yes. So that's why I started with the social, but architecturally, I think what maybe in the UK or in the West, what we struggle, I suppose, is trying to create a language, I suppose, which is Islamic, but yet Western. But I think there's a mosque in Cambridge, which has recently been done, I think does it really successfully, where we should have shown that as an example, where is a new mosque which does not struggle for its identity. I think as mosque in UK and maybe in the West, architectural identity, I think is a struggle for sure. But Cambridge Mosque does it really well.
Yes, I'll just add, just to add to that, I think you hit the nail on the head, which is that, which is why we wanted to look at geographical examples, in that from the Islamic world, there's lots of kind of very good examples of where the local context, there was like what you would maybe describe like an indigenous kind of language that emerged in these places, which are very much of that space. And I think naturally in the West, that's because that's not, I guess, at a much earlier stage within that, and it's obviously as a minority. But I think that is the challenge. The challenge is finding a language which is understood to be from both worlds in a way. So going back to that hybrid, like that's essentially, I think, so that it doesn't feel alien. So it doesn't feel that it doesn't belong. Because when you see a mosque in Africa or you see a mosque in China, it's off its context in very, just like any mosques in the Middle East and so on and so forth. I think that is the challenge. But I think, as Mohammed said, Cambridge and the two others who have really, really sort of understood that. So because the social element has now called for it, which is that third, fourth, fifth generations who live and who their home is here, but we're not a monolithic kind of culture as well, I guess, because, so for instance, ethnically Mohammed's from Afghanistan, and I'm from ethnically Albanian, so we have that different kind of ethnic mix just within our studio. So just trying to get a language that we're familiar with. So yeah, I think that's probably architecturally one of the biggest challenges, and also again, it depends regionally what part of the West. Some places are very open, like the one in Brixton. We've got a lot of support because people understand the value it brings as a local landmark. It actually becomes a visitor center. Other places may be a bit trickier. So yeah, I think that's probably the main challenge.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Abra. Thank you, Mohammed. Very fascinating talk. Very engaging as well. So we are going to be back with our Islamic art series at the Sheikh Abdullah Salam Center next week at the same time. And our next speaker is going to be Dr. Sami from Ain Shams University. His talk will be in Arabic, and it's about Arabic inscriptions, the history and the techniques and everything associated to it. So thank you and goodbye. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Much appreciated.
Thank you to